Thank you, panellists, for joining me tonight. Just to remind everyone, the intent of this panel is to provide reflections on the past to secure Australia's futures now. And for this panel session, we will be exploring how Australia's strategic policy and leadership landscape has evolved over the last 15 years and what lessons we can draw to shape the next 15. I'd like to recognise my highly esteemed female leaders in the national security community as panellists here tonight as contributions to our women in national security leadership and the diverse mix of speakers from current and future leadership. It brings me great privilege to join you here tonight. Rebecca Skinner is the former CEO of Services Australia and has a broad background in defence and national security. She served as the Associate Secretary Defence and the Deputy Secretary for Strategic Policy and Intelligence. Rebecca is also a Distinguished Advisor here at the NSC. Afia has most recently been a researcher at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, focusing on South Korean foreign policy, Indo-Pacific security and social cohesion. She is the Secretary of Women in International Security and is the committee member of Careers in Colour, a not-for-profit dedicated to advancing the inclusion of people of colour in Australian workplaces. Afia also joined us on our podcast on intergenerational security last week and provided some incredibly rich insights in relation to the future challenges faced by our future generations. And Afia is our emerging associate in the NSC. Carolyn Millar is the former Australian ambassador to the European Union, NATO, Belgium and Luxembourg. She previously served as Deputy Secretary for National Security in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, covering national security, defence, intelligence and international policy. Carolyn is also a Distinguished Advisor with the NSC. Catherine Manstead is the Executive Director of Cyber Intelligence at CyberCX Australia and New Zealand's largest cybersecurity services company. And Catherine is a Senior Fellow in the Practice of National Security at NSC. Would you join me in bringing applause to our panellists? Rebecca, it would be great to start with you and start thinking about the past and looking at the past 15 years. What stands out to you as the most significant shift in Australia's strategic environment, and how do you think we have adjusted this shift and also to this complex environment that Rory mentioned in his remarks?
Thanks, Sal. And thanks everyone for coming along this evening. It's nice to be here. I think I'd just start with a bit of a slightly deeper reflection of that 2010 moment where we create the National Security College, because I was head of the Strategic Policy Division in Defence, but also doing a review of the Woomera Prohibited Area, which at that time was probably a bit run down. We really weren't sure what we were really using it for, and there was a few people trying to invest in some mines, which we probably weren't completely on top of the strategic nature of that. But it was an initiative by the then Prime Minister. But it's also a lesson for us all in bureaucracy, because quite frankly, the vision was there, but the bureaucracy's first reaction is, I don't want to give up any resources to that. So I do think there's a level of behaviours that go on throughout our strategic, our ability to strategically deliver outcomes together, that we need to be mindful of those protectionist behaviours in our own appropriations, if you like, and that the idea of collective good needs to be part of the leadership fabric. So we'll talk a bit more about that later. But in 2010, when this all happened, Rudd had an idea of a national security strategy. It was the first time, and in somewhat a bit of a challenge to the then national security community, to expand on these ideas of security involving, in some ways, transnational threats, a bit of crime, a bit of climate change or climate issues were just coming into it. So there was a little bit of policy drawing of breath as we were forced to think more broadly. But the college enabled us to bring together some different sorts of people across the bureaucracy and engage in a richer security conversation than we would have otherwise had. We had, the world was complex, but it was pretty okay the US was still there. They had dominance in the Indo-Pacific. We weren't too worried about it. State-based threats were something we understood. There was a little bit of this occasional, thing of crime creeping in, but our main focus in a non-state basis was counter-terrorism, and so that really, even at that time, was still sucking the priorities and the focus of what we were doing with the resources. I mean, in the early 2000s, it was almost entirely what we were focused on. There was an early awareness of the rise of China, but it was the community has sort of underestimated the speed and impact that would have. So we have seen, as Rory pointed out, a really profound change in that 15 years. China is a strategic competitor to countries like the US and the broader sort of Western issues. Cyber and asymmetric threats have really come forward, and as we heard from Heather's talk a few weeks ago, just this sort of idea that technology and coordinated crime has as much impact on undermining confidence in institutions that we would never have really thought about 15 years ago. So we lose these boundaries between the military, the economic and societal sort of security, and that does require this whole of nation response. So hence back to that hook about we really need to be mindful of those leadership and bureaucratic behaviours, otherwise we won't be able to do it. We have seen, who would have thought 15 years ago that that a PLA flotilla would circumnavigate Australia and head this way again a year later. Those sorts of opportunities for force projection didn't exist. We've seen that build and build and build in the Indo-Pacific at a pace that we had not really expected, and in some ways we needed to pay more attention to it as we went along. We now have that mixed up with this idea in the last several years, and including, as Tom probably reflects, how disinformation, cyber, state crime gets in there to undermine the messages that our people are taking away in our communities, and our communities have got this sudden sort of confusion about the role of democracies. The idea that anybody would have questioned a democracy 15 years ago is quite stunning in my book. So I think the work that we've got going forward is to really focus on that and focus on all the institutional goodness that's there. We have seen the government respond. We've got much bigger investments in cybersecurity, in intelligence, in resilience. We've built workforces. We've seen national defence strategies focus on maritime and air and projection sort of powers. But we are in a budget-constrained environment that many countries are in post the COVID pandemic, and that means we need to continue to look at balancing how we're going to invest going forward. I think just to sort of wrap up, and I think we do, as we all experience, an unprecedented challenge for us going forward, and unprecedentedly in that question around institutions and trust. It is important in a democracy that we have the voting public behind the idea of democracy and what democracy is there for and how it helps individuals. So just to bring in that idea of over that 15 years, how I ended up out there running Services Australia in the midst of the pandemic, and Australian institutions were highly trusted at that point. And that point was only 3 or 4 years ago, and look what's happened there. So one of the things I think we need to think about even more broadly as a national security community is the idea that if we do not invest in strong, safe service delivery, digital identity, those sort of things that actually protect our citizens from some of those harms, then we can be erudite in thinking in a national security context. But if we don't actually think that making sure those fundamental things are there for the Australian people, then the erosion of the democracy and the trust in institutions may well continue. So I do think us thinking broadly about what is national security, We were a bit challenged at the idea. It involved climate and pandemics and some of these broader things in 2010, but I'd challenge that it is also now includes the need to make sure that there is strong, trusted delivery of services to citizens to join it all up. Thanks, Sal.
Rebecca, thank you so much for the comprehensive picture of the past 15 years and challenges. Fia, we have quite a list here. CT, climate risk, risk of China, cyber, coordinated crime, democracy, and some themes emerging on protecting digital identity and protecting our democratic resilient state. Looking into the future, and as someone representing the next generation of leaders, what do you see as being the biggest concern of Australia in the next 15 years? And what role do you think public literacy plays in future preparedness, and how can we involve the public in this discussion further?
Yeah, that's obviously a very easy question to answer. I feel like there's a little pressure. But no, thank you so much for having me here tonight, and congratulations to NSC for its 15th anniversary. So as someone who I guess is the quote-unquote youth representation on this panel, I think I'm quite optimistic about the pipeline of young people in this space when it comes to national security. As Rory has identified, there are 500 grads from the NSC. There are a range of young people interested in foreign policy and national security. We have a New Colombo Scholarship, which provides opportunities for young people to study overseas. But more broadly as well, the fact is that when it comes to national security as well, it's not just about looking at people with these skills when it comes to policy and national security, but these evolving threats such as terrorism, such as cyber, disinformation, misinformation, requires young people to also have technical skills and a lot of skills that are really useful within the national security community. So when it comes to that aspect, I see that there's a very bright future for a lot of young people, whether or not they know it, around seeing that there is a future within this sector. In terms of public literacy in the next 15 years, one thing I see that's quite an interesting challenge in particular is this disconnect between what society thinks of as national security versus us within Canberra and within the Canberra bubble as well. And it's very wonderful that NSC is doing these community consultations and engaging with wider members of the community. But we see, especially with this era of social media, with the rise of disinformation, the fact of what's going on in the US as well around social polarization, a lot of these feelings that when you're a young person in particular, maybe feeling that you aren't represented when it comes to the national security community, especially if you are a young person who might not have family or friends within this community. It might seem to be a very mysterious, shrouded context or a very interesting place to work in, but you might not necessarily understand what's going on within national security. So I'll illustrate this through a number of examples in particular. So climate change, as you rightly identified, Rebecca, is one of these key challenges that a lot of young people care about. But also this sense that despite the fact we have a Department of Climate Change, we also tried very hard to win the bid to co-host COP next year, and we have a Fair Union Treaty with Tuvalu. Despite these mechanisms, a lot of young people feeling as if, are we doing enough when it comes to the climate crisis, when it comes to engaging in the region on these issues? And the fact of the matter is as well that despite this rhetoric about the importance of climate change, 2/3 of Australia's energy generation is derived from fossil fuel sources, and we still are a very coal-dependent country. And anecdotally, I grew up in Newcastle, New South Wales, which is renowned as being the largest exporter of coal around the world. So every day I would see these coal ships exporting to markets like China from the harbour. Another issue as well is around, I think, when it comes to societal cohesion and when it comes to the fact that we have a very diverse community, whether that's in terms of multiculturalism, in terms of diversity of society, but the fact that with that comes around different perceptions and viewpoints when it comes to geopolitics as well. So in particular, the genocide that's happening in Gaza, for example, that brings up a lot of emotions for different people. So in particular, there was one really interesting survey that was done in October that showed that when looking at 1,500 voting age Australians, more than half the respondents believe that Australia should impose similar sanctions on Israel compared to the similar sanctions that we'd imposed on Russia in response to the illegal invasion of Ukraine. And a lot of those people in this survey who supported sanctions were those who are younger as well. So it's because a lot of young people who are very attuned, who are digitally online, who are engaged with the international discourse and are very intelligent, who are studying at National Security College and other places, that they have this understanding and they have this deep sense of desire to try and do more when it comes to these social issues. So while I do see that there is a lot of scope for developing national security leadership when it comes to the next generation, the reality is that a lot of young people might feel a bit disenfranchised, or they feel that maybe it is against their social, political values to be in a community where they might not feel that their values are necessarily respected. Or they see that if they go into government, if you go in from an APS 1 to 4 level as an intern, as a graduate, as a trainee, it's going to take decades for you to get into leadership. And as we know, with issues around discrimination, whether it's based on gender or cultural diversity, is it even possible for you to get into those positions of power if you are from a marginalised background? Having said that, I'm very optimistic in that the sense is, I see from my perspective, it's about changing that public messaging and that literacy as well around what national security is. Because it is an evolving sector where there are a range of different issues. It's not just these hardcore defence military issues in particular. But the fact is, within national security, sure, you can work in government, you can become a diplomat, you can work in national security, but you can work in an NGO, you can work in industry, in a think tank, in academia, become a politician, try and advocate and influence the discourse as well. So it's not very hard and fast, it's not very narrow when it comes to that sense of national security, but it's about, as young people, finding that opportunity to be able to influence the discourse as well.
Many thanks, Sophia. I think some of the topics here on social identity and cohesion for emerging generation of leadership certainly resonate, and social licence in that respect, and a hunger for younger generation to progress with progress and with purpose through many multiple and diverse means other than a typical government environment and national security community. Caroline, we've heard from Rebecca and Afia on past, present, future ambitions and visions. What does effective leadership look like in an era defined by uncertainty, speed and hybrid risks? And what would be your priorities over the next 5 years to strengthen our national preparedness and resilience?
Well, thanks very much, Sal, and it's lovely to be here. I was at the launch of the National Security College in 2010, so this is a bit of a full circle moment, and delighted that I can't actually see you, Michael, but that Michael Lestrange is here as well. Terrific. Look, for most of my career, Australia's security environment was relatively stable and secure. And as a foreign policy professional, working as an Australian diplomat, we were busy, focused, it was very meaningful, but it wasn't as consequential in as direct or an existential way as it is now. It's probably the most consequential time for people working in national security in this country and elsewhere. So for all of you who are still current practitioners or emerging practitioners, I wish you all the very best. You have a very challenging but also a very interesting a time ahead. We talk about the contested, uncertain, rapidly changing environment. Well, it's all of those things. And I think probably the crucial thing there is how quickly it's changing. It's changing faster than we can even comprehend, particularly because of the pace of technological change. So when I look at leadership, I'm thinking, first of all, leaders have got to be very tech savvy. And for those of us from my generation, we weren't particularly tech savvy, although quite a lot more so than people perhaps a little bit before us. I remember working for deputy secretaries who didn't know how to turn on a computer, for example. But now this is actually really consequential. And that means government, it means officials, it means the wider civil society. And frankly, going to your point a minute ago, I think that's where younger generations got a huge potential for impact because of your ability to use technology and all the processes of influence. I think also, and when we were in Washington, I was with Rory and the flagship SES Band 1 course a week or so ago. One of the things that Kevin Rudd spoke very strongly and powerfully about, and some of you will have heard him on this, is the need for agility and being able to pivot to the things that really matter and deliver them really fast. We have done this very well, for example, I think across government on the Pacific strategy and the Pacific Step Up, doing all sorts of things that would have seemed incredible and very unlikely only a few years ago. I do worry a little bit about our capacity as a system to do that more broadly. One of the things that's concerned me for a long time has been what I call the tyranny of process and accountability. Of course you need process, of course you need accountability, but you can spend the most enormous amount of time on that at the expense of actually delivering outcomes. And I think all Western bureaucracies actually really suffer a great deal from that. So we need leaders that can help cut through that and help develop the systems to actually deliver the outcomes we need in a very, whether there may be quite unusual ways of doing business. The other thing is leaders who are very clear in their communications. And I think this goes a little bit to the point about creating the social licence for decisions, because leaders will have to bring the public with them to make bold choices in the national security space and in the national economic space. And unless there is basically a broadly bipartisan sort of engagement with the public on these issues, I think that's going to be very, very difficult. And that really goes to my final point on the key leadership qualities, which is bipartisanship. I really worry, and you see this, of course, very starkly in the United States, where we were a week or so ago, but in all our governments, I mean, without willingness to sort of come together to make big decisions that can stand the test of the next 3 years and continue on, we're going to get into trouble, particularly as some of the decisions will require large amounts of money, for example, ramping up defence spending. So having a sort of a bipartisan, broadly bipartisan consensus about the balance between, say, what you procure, what you develop in sovereign capability in, and so on, is just going to be essential for our ability to deliver these capabilities for our secure future. So look, just sort of in terms of the national preparedness, going back to the economic and tech point, I personally would like to see a lot more investment and priority to science and tech innovation research. One of the things I was very focused on in my last job in Brussels was to try and get a lot more engagement across government on the case for Horizon Europe, and I'm delighted that the government is now pursuing this. It's the EU's flagship science and innovation programme, worth over 95 trillion euros. It operates on a scale usually only achievable in defence spending, and I always characterise it as rather like a civil plurilateral AUKUS. It has that kind of generational effect. And it focuses on all the big technologies for our future. So I'm really delighted that we've had a look at this. But that's the kind of bold initiative governments need to take, and all our like-minded partners are engaging very strongly with Horizon Europe. As part of that sort of set of issues as well, I'd like to see, and I know others have spoken about this, but AUKUS being used as a national capability development program across the board. I think we can do a lot more in that respect. Also, of course, a crucial thing is the whole suite of economic security issues. When I was in the PM&C job, and a few of you I can see in the audience will remember this well, we were really beginning sort of back in 2019 to grip up that intersection between economic security and national security. And I can remember trying to bring the economic and the national security sides of PM&C together was like, pulling teeth. And we sort of set up, crossed task forces and had Venn diagrams setting out how you did this, because it was absolutely essential to take these bold choices on the big issues that we were facing. All these issues that had never been in the national security space. Critical security of critical infrastructure, investment in telcos, all the things we now think about, but people were really beginning to grapple with. Clearly, that kind of effort is going to be even more essential going forward. So I'd like to see a lot more focus on that. The other big issue I wanted to mention was, perhaps the final one, was not being just focused on the region. Obviously, the Indo-Pacific is our region. It's very important. Our politicians talk about it a lot, as do people in this college. I have no issue with that whatsoever. The Foreign Minister gave an excellent speech to the AIIA just a few weeks ago, which he sort of set out the case for exercising agency among middle powers in the region, and talked about the government's very big commitments and achievements in the region. Terrific. But I think it's also important to recognise that some of our most consequential and like-minded partners are not in the region. And that if you look at, for example, Europe, and I bang on a bit about this as I've just got back from Europe, but if you think about Europe, we could do quite a lot more. I mean, they're the third largest trading bloc, 550 million people with a sixth of global GDP, our third largest two-way trading partner in goods and services, and second largest source of foreign investment, our most like-minded multilateral partner on just about everything you care to mention. They're a key driver of rules and norms and standards, the things we say we want all the time, which are under challenge. With their member states, the EU is the world's largest development donor. So I think it's just very important, yes, to focus on these big regional relationships, absolutely essential, no questions asked, but also to look at who are your other key partners. And of course, for us in the national security community, Five Eyes are a big part of that as well. So look, I think I probably should stop there so that our last speaker gets a go. So one final point, multilateralism and plurilateralism. There's a lot of talk about the multilateral system being under strain. Is it completely finished, etc.? Yes, it's under serious strain. Bits of it are really not operating well at all. I think as a middle power in this region, but with global interests, we have no choice but to look at what parts of that system serve our interests, while at the same time working as we do in bilaterally, trilaterally, quadrilaterally, in plurilateral groupings, issues-based groupings, interest-based groupings, to pursue our interests wherever we can. Thanks.
Thank you, Caroline. A few leadership points here for everyone to write in their notebooks that are here tonight. Outcome-focused leaders are what we need. We need people that can cut through process and accountability, but also maintain the integrity of what we're achieving. Clear communications, political will across all parties, enhanced science, technology, innovation and research, and a bolster to international partnerships with key partnerships in mind. I think there's some incredible insights there for everybody to share, to think about and reflect, particularly over the next 12 months as we continue along our concurrent and compounding pressures. But Catherine, you are a private sector key fellow here on this panel, and we'd be very keen to hear more from the operational context of national security. What are some of the biggest challenges and gaps between strategic intent and operational capability when it comes to national resilience? And how do you think private sector can go about it?
So let me answer that question by going back to the past and go back to 2010, where this conversation is starting for us in the 15th anniversary year of the NSC. And I'll take an exercise, as my colleagues at the Future Hub would say, of looking at 2010 from a technology perspective and looking at the fact that the future was kind of already here in 2010, just unevenly distributed. So if we look at what the world looked like then, Facebook had just become the world's biggest app with 500 million users. The Time Person of the Year was no other than Mark Zuckerberg. Cloud computing was just becoming mainstream. Instagram was created. And then let's look at how things have changed since then, because we all observe those changes, but to Rebecca's point, the speed and the direction of those changes, I think, took many of us by surprise. 2010, we didn't have a comprehensive national cybersecurity strategy. Since then, we've had 3 in 7 years. Facebook, I mentioned, had that user base, which was a cause of celebration. When ChatGPT entered the scene 2 years ago, it surpassed 1 million users within 5 days. It took Facebook a year to reach that milestone. Disinformation in 2010 was probably a word you could look up in the dictionary, but I don't think anyone was doing a Google search on it and thinking about national security challenges. So the way in which those challenges have metastasised, technology has absolutely driven it. But I also think there's another change that's worth thinking about over the last 15 years, which is the way in which our national security establishment and leaders now talk about national security challenges. There is a level of transparency and openness and confidence that we didn't have and maybe we didn't need in 2010. It was only about 10 years ago that Australia, for the first time, called out a foreign government by name and attributed malicious cyber activities to that government. And it wasn't China. It took us a couple of years after that to get the confidence to use the C word when it came to calling out malicious cyber activities from China. So my challenge in answering your question, Sal, is maybe twofold. One, for us to do that exercise I just did today, what is here but unevenly distributed? I think particularly about looking to Europe, as Carolyn says we should do. We have Russia on an unprecedented, unmitigated sabotage spree across non-combatant states, not in Ukraine, well, in Ukraine as well, but also across NATO countries, engaged in sabotage, physical and cyber. We're talking in the UK, in Germany, in other relatively safe countries. What does that say as a signal to us in Australia, particularly about the normalisation of sabotage in international affairs, particularly when our security agencies talk to us about active pre-positioning in Australia's critical infrastructure, where the question of whether sabotage occurs is not capability, it's one of intent, where we're held to the hostage of the intent of foreign governments to act on that pre-positioning. What, as well, if we're thinking about kind of the future being here but unevenly distributed, what is the impact of AI? We can come to that in Q&A, because in some sense I think we overhype it sometimes and focus on AI at the expense of some more urgent pressing issues. But we could also think as well about the change in stakeholders in national security. And I think that's been a theme across the panel. But my challenge is that we shouldn't just think of the public as the place that needs to have messages sent to it. It's no longer the case that Canberra sets the national security agenda, makes all the national security decisions, and the public or the regulated classes implement them. In fact, and for some 5 years now, I've had the privilege of teaching various courses on kind of what is the future of intelligence to national security cohorts. And I often ask to start anything I do in that space, I say, who are the main decision makers in national security? And because I'm evil, I'll put up a picture of the cabinet table behind me. And of course, everyone often gives that textbook answer. It's National Security Cabinet, it's the Prime Minister, it's the head of our agencies. But I'd actually say the most important and most consequential decision makers in Australia's national security are no longer sitting always in government or in Canberra. They are sitting around the boardroom tables of the private sector. And the levers of influence we have include regulation, but they also include communication and information sharing. And that can be an uncomfortable place for all of us to be in. I mentioned, just to round it back out, that we are getting more confident about communicating on national security challenges. Our political classes of different flavours have taken slightly different approaches to how they communicate about that, and it's worth thinking about the pros and cons of both approaches. We've seen our agency heads. I don't think anyone would have thought that a DG of ASIO would have given 3 consequential public speeches reported on in media in 1 year. But what is the gap there in terms of intelligence sharing to motivate change? Because from the situation of the private sector in Australia, there is always that disjunct between what is in the national interest and what is in the business interest. And those things sometimes align, but they don't always align. But nonetheless, the decisions that business takes to invest in AI, to invest in cybersecurity, to regulate and put policies in place in terms of social media use, in terms of foreign ownership, etc. Many of those things will continue to happen in the boardroom. They will not be dictated in a democracy by Canberra, but they need to be informed, intelligence-led, if I can, and based on a real appreciation of the pretty real challenges that we've surveyed here tonight.
Thank you, Catherine. A real theme on communication resonating across all our panellists tonight. Rebecca, your thoughts on transparency to maintain democratic resilience. Sophia, your thoughts on future generations and social licence. Caroline, your thoughts on clear communications as part of our leadership pursuits. And of course, Catherine, open communications and keeping the communication channels full, which brings us to question and answer time. If you do have a question, we do have some roving mics around. Please put your hand up, introduce yourself. It would be great if you could offer politely some brief remarks to allow people in the room to be able to ask as many questions as we can. And I think we have one up the top. Thanks, Ash.
Hi. My name's Nat Blakely-Parak. I'm an alumni here from the National Security College circa 2015, I think. So just wanted to start you off with a nice easy question on international security and Australia's approach to international security. We've seen the government build maybe a network, I guess, of security agreements recently over the last kind of approximately a year, but certainly over the last couple of months, we've definitely seen a step up. And, agreements such as the Nakamal agreement with Vanuatu, or the Puk agreement PNG, or even the Indonesia Common Security Treaty as well. So I guess my nice and easy question for you is kind of, as we see that kind of network build up, what's your advice to, I guess, officials, the many officials that are working in these areas, on kind of how to balance building this security lattice work with regional partners and strategic partners, with maintaining Australia's autonomous strategic choices going forward?
Thanks very much for the question. Who would like to start?
I'll say one thing probably in hand to Caroline. Negotiating agreements is more Caroline's probably space, although I have done a few myself. I don't necessarily see that there's a problem with those two things. I mean, this idea of building these security and relationship agreements in our community is an incredible strength, and in fact it's what the US did to build the alliance frameworks, which actually helped hold the global norms up for so many decades. So I think whenever you're negotiating any sort of arrangement, you are doing so from your national interest, and so I expect, not that I've been part of any of those ones, part of some in the past, that you come to the point where both countries are able to hold their view of their own national interest, so therefore maintaining that sense of autonomy at the point at which you agree those arrangements. So I'm not as concerned that would undermine Australia's autonomy as maybe some others, but I might hand to Caroline.
Look, I don't really have much to add to that, Rebecca. I mean, it seems to me that's a good thing. All those agreements are a good thing. You negotiate agreements because you believe it's in your national interest to do so, and you try and forge convergence. And I think some of the most important agreements that you make are where you don't have a complete unanimity of views, and you have to find that ground that's going to work for you. And as I said earlier, we have to do that as a middle power in the Indo-Pacific, where we don't have any sense of, we have an alliance with the United States, but we don't have a collective security arrangement around us. We have to look at building up a whole web of these sort of networks, partnerships, treaty agreements, etc. And I think some of the ones that have been done the last year or so, I haven't been involved in them either, but they seem to me to be intrinsically very worthwhile.
Hi, David Goyne, retired nobody now, but once I did work for Rebecca, who is certainly, in my experience, the very best FAS strategic policy we had in my time.
How much did you
about 50.
Agreed.
Didn't pay Dave anything, but thank you, Dave.
Look, I had an epiphany a couple of years back. I was reading a Bible of mine, the New York Times, with an article on the happiest country in the world, and it was Finland. And I always thought Finland was a sort of dark, cold place where people drank too much vodka and thought about suicide in the winter. But no, it wasn't. I thought, well, I've been working in national security my entire life in various kind of minion roles, but has that actually contributed to making Australians happier? Where do we fit on that scale of the happiest countries in the world? I don't think we were in the top 10. I think we were aced by the Kiwis, amongst others, but it was kind of Scandinavian countries and Netherlands, I think maybe the Kiwis, and then us a couple of places down. Now, there are a lot of places that were a lot lower down than us, there's no doubt about that. But what do we do in the national security space that makes Australians happy? Or is it a matter of complete indifference to most Australians what we're doing?
Not sure where to start completely, Dave, but we weren't too badly off. I think the community consultation piece of work and research will draw some of those things out. But I think that I'm not familiar. You guys are probably more familiar with Finnish culture. I haven't been there. But I would say in a sort of broader leadership context, if you want people to be happy, you're very open with them, and that actually they have a sense of accountability and mutual obligation in the outcome. And that's how the best teams that we have in the workplace are ones where there is some tension between individual requirements and holistic team outcomes or national outcomes. So I would suspect that one of the happy parts of Finland is the fact that they individually understand their collective contribution and those sacrifices that they make. They are one of the highest taxing countries, I think I understand. But that is because that all goes back into the collective good, and people see that as a fair system that keeps them happy. I think that's what it is, but I think it's part of individual obligation, not entitlement. And I think we do tend to struggle a little bit with the idea of somehow government, I'm entitled to things from government, without people really genuinely understanding that tax base is limited and needs to be shared for the collective good. And so we don't quite have the same level of probably discipline and control about how we actually think in a society about that tax base and what it could do.
Thanks, Rebecca. Catherine?
I haven't looked at the Finland studies recently, but certainly one of the things with Finland, of all of the countries in the world, it is one that sits with an existential threat hanging over its head. And its public, if anything, are more aware of that existential threat than any other public, and there's a lot of community engagement in that. So, of course, it's an oversimplification to say if you've got a clear view of who the adversary is, you bond together, but that is, in some sense, an inherent human trait to have an us and them. Now, I'm not saying we have a national security policy for that purpose, but it might influence one of the reasons why Finland is so high. But I think there's another point to your question, what do we do for happiness? I think that's one of the reasons why national security is so now mainstream, because as the parameters of national security have broadened, the issues it treats are broader too. Social cohesion is essential to national security, and I don't think you can have a populace that is happy if they're deeply divided, polarised, and engaging in kind of flame wars on social media fuelled by disinformation. Cybersecurity is mainstream now in a way that it wasn't a couple of years ago, because we had our Optus and Medibank moment, and suddenly individuals realised the consequences to them of poor cyber security and the benefits of government investing more in scam prevention and cybersecurity prevention. So perhaps we're in an era where cybersecurity and happiness are more related than they ever have been.
I'll just quickly comment on that as well. I think going back to your point, Rebecca, around leadership and inclusion within leadership, something that I think is quite important when it comes to that leadership is that diversity of thought. Because if you have teams that have diversity of age, of background, of culture, of all these different traits, you have people's views and opinions reflected within that. So when it comes to the national security community, traditionally in Australia, obviously traditionally it's been quite homogenous. So with all these programs that NSC is implementing through including women, culturally diverse people, First Nations, Australians, that's a way to ensure that those parts of society that have been traditionally marginalised are also reflected within leadership, and hopefully leads to happier outcomes because we feel as if we are represented in these decisions as well.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Anthony.
I'm Anthony Berg and I'm an associate at the college. In the last 2 weeks, and this goes to the point that a couple of speakers raised about preparedness and resilience, in the last 2 weeks we've seen Germany and France announce programs for voluntary military service for 18-year-olds. And I'd like to ask whether any of the panel have any comment on whether such program would work in this country.
Always end with a tough question. Anyone, panellists?
It's not in the social licence in Australia, so I don't think there is an appetite. So I doubt we'd see that here at this point in the strategic risk cycle.
Yeah, I'll also quickly comment on that as well. So one country I look at closely is South Korea, and obviously we know that South Korea faces this existential threat of North Korea, and because of that, we see conscription and that they've built this social license where it's mandatory for males to go to the military for 18 months. So I think also related to Catherine's point about the fact, well, when we look at in Australia, do we have a clear enemy? Do we have this distinct existential threat that we're facing? It seems that we have a diversity of different threats that we're facing, but unless we have this common threat or this common enemy we can all get behind, especially with the diversity of society and people from different backgrounds, it seems like it would be a very hard sell for me personally, I think.
Look, I agree with all of that. Of course, in Europe, you have a very different set of circumstances, which you alluded to with the Russian threat, and you were talking about the myriad ways in which that manifests itself. You also have a lot of pressure in NATO countries from the United States. In the last NATO summit, in the middle of the year, there was an agreement very strongly pushed by its largest and most influential member for NATO countries to commit to 5% of GDP on defence spending, 3% on core spending and 2% on sort of more peripheral spending. European countries, particularly France, but others as well, Germany, others, are looking at how they can ramp up their whole sovereign capability in defence and spend more on defence to meet that requirement. So you're looking at a whole very different set of circumstances there, I think, from those facing Australia. I think our isolation does make us perhaps a little bit complacent, which is one thing I didn't mention in my comments. I do worry about that. We may be slightly anxious as the community consultations show, but we're also, I think, still a little bit complacent because of the distance. But I think the situation here is very different from that in Europe.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we can't take further questions, but we do have our networking session following on from the formalities. So if you do have a question for one of our panellists, please feel free to approach them during that period. But could you please provide a vote of thanks and an applause to our wonderful panellists, Rebecca Skinner, Afia Akin, Caroline Millar and Catherine Manstead, for their wonderful insights today. And of course, tonight's event was formed part of our flagship Women in National Security initiative, which has also been growing in leaps and strides every year. And I wanted to pay particular homage to our previous deputy heads, who are also females in national security who have paved the way. And I'm hoping you wouldn't mind just standing up so everyone can see you. I can see, Caroline, you're very excited to do this. We have Carolyn Van Heusen, we have Sarah Roberts, Carolyn Ball, Nicola Rosenblum, Sharon Dean, and our wonderful existing Deputy Head Jane Gillis. If we can give them a big applause. Thank you. Again, another talking partner during networking event to our Deputy Heads. We're all pleased to see the evolution of this initiative in tonight's panel discussion, and what I'm particularly impressed by is that we have evolved the concept of women in national security, where female leadership is being celebrated for expertise and thought leadership, so thank you. I would like to again thank Professor Rory Metcalf, our panellists, members of the NSC Advisory Board, and all NSC alumni and friends of the college who've joined us this evening. I'd also like to thank Tanush Parak, wherever you are, for organising tonight. It's a huge event, huge preparation, and Jed Buchanan and Brooke Mayfield as well. So please join us in celebratory drinks and canopies and use this opportunity to reconnect with old colleagues, make new connections, and hope that you continue being part of this growing community. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your evening.